Hello again, class. Today we're going to keep talking about America's political heritage. This will be the third, and I suspect we'll finish this little series of lessons. It'll probably be the third and last we do on the political heritage. So first we're going to start talking about the Enlightenment. You've probably come across this term in some of your other classes, particularly if you're taking a world or history class, or maybe even in world geography. But the Enlightenment was a movement, again, in the 17th and 18th centuries. So again, those would be the 16 and 1700s. So the time period we've mainly been talking about in our last lecture. Remember, our last lecture dealt with self-government in the 13 colonies. Well, while America was governing itself to some extent, through the House of Burgesses, Mayflower Compact, etc., over in Europe, and to some extent in America as well, there was a movement called the Enlightenment taking place. And what the Enlightenment was this idea or a series of ideas and thoughts that stressed science and reason. Now, when I'm talking about reason in this context and throughout this lecture, I'm not going to be talking about the reason as in why someone did something or an excuse for doing something. Reason in this context means rational thought. Think about something rationally and logic, to use logic to solve problems. And there was a movement, like I say, starting in the 1600s and throughout the 1700s called the Enlightenment, where certain scientists and philosophers really started thinking that if mankind could just, use logic and reason to think about problems, that they could start solving the problems instead of simply relying on monarchs or church leaders to tell them what to do and how to solve problems, or instead of relying on superstition and just some sort of custom, that people should really treat problems as something that can be solved if you just basically thought long and hard enough about it. All right. Now, a lot of this has to do with science. There's a lot of scientific discoveries and innovations during this time period. And we're not going to talk about the science that part of the Enlightenment, really, because we're more focused on, government and political thought. But the same idea that pushed science during the Enlightenment also pushed new ideas in the realm of government and politics. They took this same sort of notion, almost like, if we can solve problems in science through like the scientific method, why can't we use something similar like that in government and politics and think about these things rationally, and to say, well, it's always been that a king's been in charge and he gets to tell people what to do, instead of just accepting that, to really start thinking about how the world does work and how it should work. And so that was what the Enlightenment had to offer. So again, we're going to be focusing on the government part, but just to understand these two things are connected. You can't really talk about the Enlightenment without understanding that it affects both science and government and other types of thought as well. Although we will, throughout the rest of this little lesson, focus solely on the government and politics aspect of the Enlightenment. And specifically, I just want to give you a few famous Enlightenment thinkers and kind of what they had to say about government and how government should be structured. First, we'll talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We've talked about him before in connection with the social contract. We talked about him when we talked about types of government. We talked about how governments develop in the social contract theory. And remember, Rousseau's thought was that people shouldn't have to obey the laws unless they've agreed to them. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you get to disobey any law you don't like. But what it means is that as long as you get some sort of say in the political process to elect leaders or that sort of thing, you have to obey the laws because you've entered into the social contract where, the people will get to vote in exchange for following the law, that sort of thing. All right, John Locke. he argued that all people had what he called natural rights. These are rights that come not from a king or from a government, but from nature. In other words, you're kind of born with them. And examples he gave were the right to life, liberty, and property. Now, in the second part of today's lecture, after I talk about the Enlightenment, I'm going to jump ahead to the writing and the acceptance of the Declaration of Independence in America. And there's a reason I wanted to talk about the Declaration of Independence in the same lesson we talked about John Locke. So remember Locke and his idea that all people have natural rights such as life, liberty, and property. There's also this guy named Charles Montesquieu. He wrote a book called The Spirit of Laws that explained governments should divide power among different branches of government. In other words, he describes separation of powers. Now, we're not going to talk about separation of powers specifically again in this lesson, but you should understand that the American government is certainly based on separation of powers. We have three branches of government: executive, judicial, legislative, etc. And so when we get into the Constitution and talk about how it is structured, remember Montesquieu. He had talked about this in his book, Spirit of Laws. William Blackstone. So he was an English lawyer who spent a number of years collecting all of, or at least as many as he could, English laws into a single set of commentaries. Now, we may not think that's very remarkable, because we live in society. It's like, well, of course the laws are written down. How else are you going to know, what they are? And anyone can, look them up on the internet or see what laws are being passed and that sort of thing. But when Blackstone lived, the English law had developed over centuries and centuries. And, judges or lawyers may know them, basically. But there wasn't a single set where all of them had been written down basically in one place. And so he spent a lot of his life doing that. And he also believed in this concept of natural rights. And he believed government is there to protect natural rights, which are given by God, not politicians. All right, so you've seen a couple of these philosophers already talking about this idea that, our rights come from nature or from God. And they're given to us, by a higher power than some sort of king or government. And since they are given to us by a king and government, it's the government's job to protect them, but they don't have the right to take them away from us. We'll see this thought again in the Declaration of Independence here in a minute. Then the last person I want to talk about is Benjamin Franklin. We know Benjamin Franklin, the guy who flew the kite in the lightning storm, discovered electricity. If you remember your 8th grade history, he was also instrumental in at the Constitutional Convention. So understand, Franklin's very much of the Enlightenment. He originally made his fame in the world of science. He actually, the early part of his life, he was a businessman, made lots of money. Then he devoted the middle part of his life to science, became one of the most famous scientists in the world. Lived a long time, probably for 20 years over in Europe, just being a famous scientist. And then in the later part of his life, he became involved in the Revolution, and he helped write the Constitution. So if this idea that the Enlightenment affects, both science and reason and politics and government, Benjamin Franklin embodies that as much as anybody in both the scientific discoveries he made earlier in his life and then the political and government contributions he made in helping to write the Constitution. All right, so what does any of this have to do with America's government? Well, as I said, I want to jump ahead to the Declaration of Independence here in a minute, but just remember, our founding fathers were going to be very, very familiar with Moses, with the Ten Commandments. Again, they wouldn't have necessarily known about Hammurabi's Code, but to the extent that Moses' law in the Old Testament is pretty similar in a lot of aspects to Hammurabi's Code, and the founding fathers knew of it, that would certainly affect their thinking. They certainly knew about the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights and these things, and they were big readers of the Enlightenment thinkers. So they knew all of these ideas. So, for in some cases, like those ancient laws for thousands of years, or in some cases, in terms of the Enlightenment for maybe 100 years, all of these ideas had been building until we get to the Declaration of Independence. All right, so some of this will be a very brief history lesson. I don't really want to focus on the history of the Revolutionary War or anything like that. So I'll just use a couple of reminders here, but we'll really focus on the structure and what the Declaration says rather than the history of it. So once the Revolutionary War starts in 1775, all 13 colonies meet in Philadelphia in what's called the Second Continental Congress. And in the spring of 1776, they start debating whether to declare independence. All right, so we look back now and we say, okay, independence was inevitable, but it wasn't necessarily so. There were a lot of people throughout 1775 and early 1776, even after the war broke out, who still were hoping that America could just solve its problems with the king and go back to the way things used to be. We know that's not what's going to happen, but there were people who were still hoping for that during that time period. So while the Second Continental Congress is debating whether to declare independence or not, they realized, well, if we are going to declare independence, we should have some document that explains why and what we're doing. So they appointed a committee to write the Declaration. And the members of this committee, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and lastly, a 33-year-old named Thomas Jefferson, who, obviously now he's just as, if not more famous than any of that group. He may not be more famous than Benjamin Franklin, but certainly he's as famous as any of that group. But at the time, he was probably the least well-known of this group. He was the youngest, and so he hadn't been around as long. He hadn't been around as long. But ultimately, the committee's going to choose him to write the Declaration. One, he was a really good writer. Two, he wasn't a very good speaker, though, so he really wasn't helping out the cause while they were debating independence. So Franklin and Adams thought, well, let's put him to use. Let him do something useful like writing the Declaration, since he's really not helping in these debates at all. All right, so, the Continental Congress debates whether or not to vote for independence for months. And finally, on July 2nd, the Congress does, in fact, vote for independence. So by that time, America really Continental Congress considered itself free. But again, they wanted a document to explain to the world what they were doing and why they were doing it. And so on July 4th, 1776, Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence that had been primarily written by Jefferson. Now, he had others look at it and revise it and give suggestions, most of which he pouted about. He thought his first, the draft he presented to them was absolutely perfect and that no one else could dare to improve upon it. But the committee and the people in Congress did change it here and there. But we think of Jefferson as the primary author. Right. And again, that was adopted on July 4th, 1776. And as you see on the right, the biggest name right there in the center, a guy named John Hancock, who was president of the Continental Congress, was the first to sign the Declaration, and thus the first to commit treason in writing. Because understand, rebelling against the king and declaring yourself somehow outside of the jurisdiction of the King of England in these colonies was in fact treason. All right, so the people signing this were basically admitting they were committing a crime that's punishable by death. But nonetheless, they all signed it, and no one signed it bigger or more legibly than John Hancock. Okay. All in all, 56 men signed the Declaration. Now, much of the Declaration is based on John Locke's philosophy. So I told you earlier that there was a reason I wanted to put these two lessons together, lesson on the independence, where we talk about Locke, and then Declaration lesson together, because much of the Declaration is based on John Locke's philosophy. For instance, the Declaration states that people have unalienable rights, which are rights that cannot be taken away. Now again, it's not word from word from John Locke. He talked about natural rights, but it's very similar in concept. So I guess I should have put that prompt up before I answer that question. John Locke had called them natural rights. Jefferson changes them to unalienable rights. All right, so in the preamble, which is the type of introduction, and I call it preamble / statement of beliefs. Some people treat the preamble as really being the first couple paragraphs. Other people break it up into, you have a short preamble, which basically just says, you know, when you're breaking up with your king, you should at least tell him why. That's a very short statement at first, and then you get into your statement of beliefs, which is the part of the Declaration that we're all familiar with, the part that, you know, we all hear repeated over and over again. So whether you want to call that whole thing the preamble or whether you want to call the second paragraph the statement of beliefs, just know that Jefferson, after first explaining, hey, we're writing this to explain why we're, you know, breaking up with England, then he writes the most famous words in the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If you need to write that down, just pause and write that down. I understand I went through that pretty quickly, but we're all familiar with that phrase, or hopefully we all are. And so after Jefferson writes this initial phrase, all right, so remember that all men are created equal and that they're given rights by their Creator, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay. Jefferson writes that phrase, and then next he says that if a government ignores or violates these rights, then the people have the right to abolish or destroy that government. Okay. So understand what he's saying. Not only, according to the Declaration, not only do people have rights that can't be taken away, but if those rights are ignored or violated by the government, then the people should get rid of and destroy that government. All right? So this is very much putting the people, you know, in a higher place of importance than the government, which certainly is not the case when you live in a country with a monarch that rules his subjects. They're not even called citizens; they're called subjects. Right? They're people that the monarch, you know, commands. All right, but the Declaration says no. All right, if any government violates the people's rights, then the people have the right to destroy it. That was the Declaration of Independence and belief. Now, the practical thing is, after destroying an old government, you need to form a new government. All right, so that's sort of how Jefferson wraps up this section on the statement of beliefs. So, you know, to me, that's kind of part one. All right, Jefferson lays out what America believes. And America believes that all people have certain rights, and if those rights are violated by the government, then the people have the right to basically change governments. All right, that's part one. Part two is Jefferson needs to explain why the 13 colonies are actually breaking away from Britain. All right, so he goes from the general idea that, okay, all people have rights that have to be protected. Now he's going to go to the specific. He's going to give specific examples of how the King and Parliament have not protected those rights. All right, whereas I wrote, somewhat jokingly in this slide, he's going to list every mean and unfair thing the King and Parliament ever did to the colonies. In this section, or the kind that I said is like section 2, these are called the grievances. All right, a grievance is a complaint. All right, think of the word grief. If you have grief, you're very sad, right? Well, a grievance is a complaint that you have. All right, so this section of the Declaration, this middle part, are called grievances. Thomas Jefferson's listing America's grievances against the king and against Parliament back in Britain. All right. And Jefferson says, look, we tried to address these grievances, but the king ignored them. All right. Again, I don't want to get into all the history of the Revolutionary era. But basically, Jefferson's saying, look, we tried to make our complaints known. We petitioned the king to help us out and to tell Parliament to quit taxing us without representation and canceling our assemblies and all these sort of things. But the king didn't listen. So, therefore, the colonies now declare their independence. All right. So I see this as the third part of the Declaration of Independence. Okay. Jefferson talks about, first, he says, these are our beliefs. All people have rights. And if they get violated by the government, then the people have the right to change governments. In Section 2, Jefferson says, okay, here are all the ways that the British government have violated our rights. Okay? And then in Section 3, he kind of ties it together and says, okay, well, since we have the right to change governments for, if our rights are violated, and since I've just given you, 20-something examples of our rights being violated, then therefore we have the right to change governments, and that is exactly what we're doing. That is exactly what Jefferson does in the Declaration. So, before we get to Franklin's famous, although probably made-up quote, just understand how this was very much a product of the Enlightenment. Okay, Jefferson starts off with saying inalienable rights, whereas Locke had said natural rights. Jefferson says that these rights we have are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, whereas John Locke had said life, liberty, and property. All right, so again, Jefferson's not taking everything John Locke said, but certainly there's a lot of similarities there. Okay? And then this whole idea that a government is there to protect your rights, and that if it doesn't, then the people have the right to change governments. All right, well, think back to, Blackstone said a government is there to protect our rights. They're given to us by God, not politicians. Think back to Rousseau, who said this is a contract. And essentially what Jefferson is doing is accusing Britain of violating their contract, their social contract with America. And since they violated this social contract, we no longer have to live up to the contract. Right? Think about just a regular contract. Think about if you have a contract with someone that says, okay, I'll pay you, $10 on Tuesday, and on Friday you'll deliver me, 10 hamburgers or something. Well, if the first person in that contract doesn't actually deliver what they're supposed to deliver, the money, for instance, then the second person doesn't have to live up to their part of the contract. They don't still have to cook the hamburgers on, on Friday, or whichever day I said. So that's sort of what's going on here. The governments, their part of their contract was to protect people's rights. And if the government protects people's rights, then the people will, obey the government. But since the British government did not live up to its end of the bargain, they did not protect the American people's rights, then America no longer has to live up to their end of the contract, which is obeying, King George in Parliament. All right, so understand the Declaration is absolutely a document out of the Enlightenment. Okay? It absolutely comes straight out of the Enlightenment. It is very much a document of its age. So after the Declaration of Independence is authorized, Benjamin Franklin maybe, possibly, could have, probably not, but it's fun to think that he said it. It's a neat little phrase there of wordplay. We must all hang together, or we shall all hang separately. All right, so if he said it, what he's saying is, all right, we better all work together to make this government work and to win a Revolutionary War, or we'll all be hanged for treason. So, again, Benjamin Franklin, I want to talk about that because that is a quote that's often accredited to Franklin after the Declaration's adopted. I don't think there's a whole lot of hard evidence that he really actually said it, but we can pretend. All right, and so in the second part of this lesson, we talked about the examples of self-government in the 13 colonies, House of Burgesses, Mayflower Compact, Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, Pennsylvania Charter of Privileges. So we're going to end this three-part lesson on political heritage, just giving examples of self-government within what is now the United States. First, you have the Declaration of Independence, which declares our independence from Britain, declares ourselves, an independent and new nation. And then, 11 years later, they have to write the Constitution. Once they've gained their freedom, they need an actual government. So they write the Constitution that creates three branches of government, separation of powers between the branches. It's limited government. It's a form of self-government. So it's all these principles that we've been talking about during this series of lectures are embodied in the Constitution. And our next unit that we'll talk about is dealing with how the Constitution is structured and what are some of its key terms and provisions. All right, so we'll take the examples of self-government that existed prior to the Constitution, and we'll see how all of them sort of are sprinkled in and mixed into the actual text that becomes our Constitution.